It is a great pleasure to welcome to this forum Michael Mauboussin, Director of Research at BlueMountain Capital Management. Michael truly needs no introduction to the MOI Global community, but let me give a little bit of an introduction anyway. Before Michael joined BlueMountain, he was head of global financial strategies at Credit Suisse and chief investment strategist at Legg Mason Capital Management. He's also the author of 3 books, including More Than You Know, Finding Financial Wisdom in Unconventional Places. It was named in the 100 Best Business Books of All Time by 800 CEO Read, and it is the subject of our conversation today. Michael has also been an adjunct professor of finance at Columbia Business School since 1993 and received the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence in 2009 and 2016. He is chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Santa Fe Institute, a leading center for multidisciplinary research in complex systems theory. And I know that many of our members have read Michael's terrific white papers as well. So it's not just the books, there is so much to learn from beyond that. Michael, let's talk about More Than You Know. What inspired you to write that book in the first place?
Well, first of all, John, great to be with you, and thanks for the opportunity to visit with you and with your audience. Maybe I'll touch on 2 things. First is some of the influences I had going into that, and then a little bit on the actual specific catalyst for More Than You Know. You know, the really big theme of More Than You Know is thinking about the world, that thinking in the world in a multidisciplinary, through multidisciplinary lens will make you just a better thinker. It'll make you a better person, a better parent, a better spouse. And the metaphor I always like to use for that, which has been well used, is that of a toolkit. In other words, if you have a really full toolkit of different types of tools, no matter what problem you tend to see, you'll have the appropriate tool to try to solve that problem. And you know, if you have just one tool or a couple of very blunt tools, you'll be using the wrong tools to try to solve the problems. I will just mention that that kind of research, that mindset has been deeply influenced by a number of sources. But first I'll mention that there's a lot of actual scientific support for the virtues of a multidisciplinary point of view. I'll mention work by 2 scientists. One is Scott Page at the University of Michigan. Scott wrote a book that came out after More Than You Know, but came out in 2007 called The Difference. He more recently wrote a book called The Diversity Bonus. Both of those demonstrate actually the mathematics, like the quantitative case for why cognitive diversity helps solve difficult problems. So this is not just sort of a wave our hands kind of thing. There's actually really good evidence that it works. The second researcher I'll mention is Phil Tetlock at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2006, Phil wrote an outstanding book called Expert Political Judgment about how difficult it was for experts to make quality forecasts. There was a really interesting little piece of research in there saying that, you know, there are different kinds of thinkers, which he called hedgehogs and foxes. This is based on the Isaiah Berlin essay. Hedgehogs are those people that know one big idea, and they fit their worldview into that. And foxes are people that know a little bit about a lot of different things and tend not to be wedded to any particular point of view. And what Tellock showed was that foxes are actually better forecasters, or really better thinkers. And you know, following up with that, he wrote another book called Super Forecasters about people who are great forecasters. And it turns out that one of the key characteristics of those people is that they are actively open-minded. So they're thinking about lots of different things and willing to take on different points of view. Probably for your audience, I would say the 2 big other influences, first is Charlie Munger's. And of course, Munger's mental models approach. And you could read about this, I'm sure all your members have read about it, but Poor Charlie's Almanac is just a great read, and one of those ones that every investor who's serious should go back to read periodically. By the way, I met Charlie Munger for the first time in December. It was a real bucket list moment for me, and it was just awesome. Munger's got a quote which I've always loved, which is, if you want to be a good thinker, you must develop a mind that jumps jurisdictional boundaries. And that very much is an animating concept. And the last thing I'll mention as an influence is the Santa Fe Institute. I'm actually in Santa Fe, New Mexico now. You mentioned I'm chairman of the board of trustees. I would just say that Santa Fe Institute is a super interesting place. It was started about 35 years ago by a number of academics who felt that academia had become too siloed, and that many of the most vexing and interesting problems in our world were at the intersection of disciplines. And as a consequence, they started an institute to transcend these jurisdictional boundaries and have people work on these really difficult problems. So just that's a little bit of background on the influence. And I would just say that this way of thinking about the world is not everybody's cup of tea, but I think it very much is in the bones of More Than You Know. So now to answer your question more directly, how did this book come, how this book come about? So I'm one of those people, which can be slightly annoying, who reads something or watches something or sees something and thinks about sort of connections or corrections, actually, in terms of the thing. And so I found myself, sort of talking back to my books or talking to my TV, and that's just not a super effective way to go through life. So I thought to myself, I should really start writing about these connections that I see or interesting how ideas can spill over from one to the other. But I'll say that there was a very specific catalyzing moment for me. My wife had a beloved grandfather, a great guy, who in the summer of 2000 handed me a copy of Time magazine, which had on the cover Tiger Woods. Now, Tiger Woods, of course, a very famous golfer, but the story here was that in 1997, so 3 years prior, he had won the Masters golf tournament. He was 21 years old. He won it by 12 strokes, kind of going away. It was this extraordinary story. And he watched the tape of his performance, and he came to this conclusion that his swing was no good. So he called his coach, and they revamped the swing. And the initial reaction was that he became less effective as a golfer. And then he came roaring back and had like a spectacular string of victories with this revamped swing. So that immediately conjured in my mind something I had learned about at the Santa Fe Institute, this concept called fitness landscapes. And fitness landscapes, just imagine looking out, at a landscape with mountains of different heights. And you can think of mountains, the height of the mountain is some measure of fitness or goodness. And you think about, you walk up and down these mountains, right? So you go up to a mountain and you're at the peak. But there may be a mountain with a higher peak out there. And so for you to get to the higher peak, you have to sometimes go into the valley to climb back up to the peak. And I thought that what Tiger Woods was doing was actually an incredibly good illustration of this idea that he was at a local peak. He was the best golfer in the world at the time, but he said, I can be even better. So he degraded his performance for a short period of time to become even better. So that launched me into these essays. We wrote them every 2 weeks. This is really in early 2000s. By the way, I targeted 1,500 words, which is a short, you try to develop an idea, but fairly short so people could read it. And we called it the Consilient Observer. So that was the name of the original essays. By the way, that is another story in and of itself. I was inspired very much by E.O. Wilson's book, Consilience, which came out in 1998. Consilience is also a book I'd recommend. The consilience is a very unusual word. It's about 150 years old. And it really means the unification of knowledge. And in this book, Wilson argues that for us to advance in the scientific world, we really need to appeal to consilience, the unification, again, this transdisciplinary effort. So these essays were out, and then a publisher approached me and said, hey, listen, we should put these things together, let you write little introductions to various sections, and that became More Than You Know. So that's sort of the long intellectual journey behind it, but that's what inspired me to do it in the first place. And a lot of it is this idea that we are just better people if we think about lots of different disciplines.
Terrific. Well, the book covers a lot of ground and does that masterfully. You organized it into 4 sections: investment philosophy, psychology, innovation and competitive strategy, and finally science and complexity theory. To start a little bit on the investment philosophy side, you draw this distinction between profession and business when it comes to investing. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, this is a really important point. This was inspired by an essay written by Charlie Ellis in 2001. And the argument is, if you think about investing, there are sort of 2 components. The profession, as you pointed out, and the profession's all about generating excess returns for your investors. And presumably as a leader of an organization or a portfolio manager, you yourself are very invested in that yourself. So the key to the profession is it has a certain cadence. You want to have, in most cases, you want to take the long view. You want to be, as Buffett would say, fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. And so in a sense, you're kind of working counter to the broad world. The business of investing is ultimately just like any other business, which is revenues and costs. And the business of investing would basically say your business is usually going to be better if you gather more assets. So the business side is about gathering assets. Now, just to be super clear about this, you need a good business to support a profession, right? So you need to be able to compensate people and hire the right people and have the right organization and resources, for example, to do your research in a quality fashion. But that said, the argument that Els made, to which I was very sympathetic, was that a lot of investment organizations had tilted more toward the business side than the profession side. And so the evidence of that would be things like, and by the way, the other guy who wrote very elegantly about this, I mean, Els got me going on this, but was Jack Bogle. And so when organizations, for example, a particular asset class or a particular product may be hot, it is the investment organization's focus on the business that will launch products in that area, right? Because they're satiating a demand. Whereas an organization focused on the profession might say, A, we're not going to do that because we think that the prospective returns are not very attractive. And actually may go a step further and say the products we want to launch are going to be in areas that are today very much ignored and where we think we can plant seeds that will bear fruit down the road. So this is this balance between, so obviously, again, a good business is important to a good profession, but this idea as an organization, what becomes the most important thing? I'll just tell you one little side story. I think he won't mind that I'll mention this, and that's a conversation I had with Wally Weitz, who's just a great investor. He's based in Omaha. And, Wally's he's got a great track record and built a very nice business for himself. But Wally said to me one day, he's like, I was just thinking to myself, like, if I really wanted to crank this thing, if I really wanted to grow my business really rapidly, there would be ways for me to do this in certain distribution channels and so on and so forth. He said, but, every time I think about it, I sort of look at the plan and then I put it back in my drawer and close it and say, like, we're really here to methodically deliver these excess returns. And so I just thought that was a great example of someone who actually very overtly thought about this profession versus business thing and came down on the side of the profession, which is great.
What parallels would you draw between investing as a profession and sports as a profession?
Well, I actually think there are a lot of parallels, and I'd even go beyond sports. When you say sports, I don't know, like if you mean sports team management, like GMs, but
actually more top athletes and how they approach their
yeah.
craft.
Okay, yeah. So this is not in the book, but I would just say, to me, I've been very enamored with this concept of athletes. And we could say, as you point out, in athletics, we have physical athletes. So, and in our business, they're not physical athletes, but they're mental athletes. And so you'd say, what does a physical athlete have to do to be at his or her peak performance? And the answer is, you want to have an appropriate training program. And that's where the stuff by way of, for example, on deliberate practice, so operating at the limit of your performance, things that are relevant in the context of the game that you play. And the other side of it is you really want to make sure that you're doing other things properly. For example, rest, nutrition, sleep. These are essential ingredients to performing well as an athlete, a physical athlete. And then you say, as a mental athlete, what do you want to do? So as an investor, and I would just say that, by the way, those other things, including rest, including sleep, including nutrition, are actually really important. I'm on a big kick on sleep. I think sleep is something that's vastly underestimated, and you can get a really important cognitive boost by just sleeping the appropriate amount and making sure that's built into your routine. But training for me would be really mostly reading. We'll call it learning in general, but mostly reading. And it's been my experience, and many of the great investors I've been around, and I've had the fortune to be around a lot of really great investors, spend a lot of their days just reading and thinking. And what's interesting about that is there's no expectation for an immediate payoff. You're not reading something so as to do something. You're reading to gather and build your knowledge base so that when an opportunity presents itself, you're in a position to take advantage of it because you've prepared your mind, just like an athlete's prepared him or herself for a particular situation. And, you know, it's funny, for example, Warren Buffett, or, you know, even his colleagues, but certainly Warren Buffett, you know, people are always surprised when someone sends a business proposal to him and he acts on it in fairly short order. And they're like, well, how could you really understand that? Well, the answer is he's preparing every single day, right? So he's made a career of preparing himself for these kinds of situations. So when they appear, he knows what to do with it quickly. So I think there actually are a lot of parallels between those things. A lot of it boils down to the simple concept of preparation, but other components like rest and time away and sleep are actually really, I think, also essential to be a successful mental athlete, just as you want to be a successful physical athlete.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned sleep because it's a little bit of a contrarian view these days. It seems we read so much about successful entrepreneurs waking up at all hours of the night and squeezing the last minute out of sleep, if it were. So clearly, it sounds like you come down on the side of we shouldn't try to economize sleep too much.
Well, I'll mention, John, quickly, there's just a wonderful book by Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep. Before reading it, I certainly thought I knew the overall story, and I think I basically had the idea. But that is not only a fascinating book, and it's obviously scientifically grounded book, but compelling. I found myself walking everywhere. Everyone I bumped into, I would talk to him about it. And there's just a lot of research that demonstrates that proper amount of sleep really is a big, well, let's say differently, a detriment of sleep is really will impede your cognitive performance, and that's, you know, learning and memory and so on and so forth. Now, look, there are certain times when extreme times when you may not be able to get the sleep that you hope for, but as a day in, day out for most of us in our day-to-day routines, there really is no excuse for not getting the appropriate amount of sleep.
Tell us a little about the Babe Ruth effect, please.
So this is an interesting one and by the way, the background story on this is I was with a money manager who was running money for a particular state pension. And they got a new treasurer, and the guy just went through all the money managers they had hired. And essentially, if they were in the bottom quartile or bottom quintile or something like that, he just basically fired all the worst performers in a recent period, right? Save one, which happened to be this particular money manager. And nope, I take that back. Pardon me. I'm saying it wrongly. He actually went through all the money managers and looked at what percent of their investments, I'd be more precise, what percent of their investments beat the market. And he fired the ones that are at the bottom. Save one, and this one manager had a preponderance of investments that did not beat the market, but his overall portfolio did much better than the market. And so it was this sort of interesting thing. And by the way, it's interesting, on Wall Street, you will often hear people say things like, if I can be right 53% of the time, I'm going to be great, I'll make lots of money. That statement is accurate in the context of trading. So if you're just trading all day and you're slightly more right than you're wrong, you'll do fine. But the Babe Ruth effect basically says that the frequency of correctness doesn't matter. It's how much money you make when you're right. So the magnitude matters. So it is often the case that even great money managers are wrong a majority of the time on their investments. That is, they lose money, but the things that they make money on make so much money that they compensate for those losses and then some. One example is George Soros. And one of his colleagues reported that Soros made money on 30% or less of his trades, but of course the guy's a multi-billionaire. So why did I call it the Babe Ruth effect? I try to make that a little bit of a vivid idea, which is when Babe Ruth retired, he of course had the all-time record for home runs, but he also had the all-time record for strikeouts. So it wasn't how often he was, like the magnitude of his performance, the home runs probably more than compensated for the strikeouts that he had over time. So that's the big lesson. It's not the frequency of correctness that matters. It's the magnitude of correctness, how much money you make when you're right versus how much money you lose when you're wrong. I'll just mention one other thing that's really interesting, and this came post a lot of the stuff more than you know, but there is a whole trading strategy called trend following, and trend following's got a sort of formulaic approach. If you look at the payoffs, what you find is that they lose money on a majority of trades, but they have a right tail of payoffs that allow the strategy to be overall very fruitful. So that's the baby boom effect.
Tell us a little about how you think about expertise and experts.
This is a very hot topic. In particular, there's sort of a back and forth between Danny Kahneman, of course, the eminent psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, and Gary Klein, who is an outstanding social psychologist and a very interesting guy in his own right. And Gary's argument was a lot about what's called naturalistic decision making, that you put people in certain environments and they very quickly can answer problems. So that he talked about firefighters and emergency healthcare providers and so forth. And Kahn's argument, as you know, is much more that often this system, one sort of automatic system, leads to poor results. So the question becomes, what is expertise and how does it work? And the way I would come down on this is expertise or intuition tends to work when you've trained yourself thoroughly in a stable and linear environment. So you think about, the canonical example would be chess, but you could think of even things like expert drivers or even athletes or soldiers are trained in a specific set of environments that are sufficiently stable and linear that their actions always lead to the right outcomes. And that's where things like expertise truly can develop. But if you introduce nonlinear environments or unstable environments, it's very difficult to achieve so-called expertise. In 2001, Buffett had a great, and I think I put that in the essay, in 2001, Buffett had a great letter, and he was talking about obviously the wake of 9/11, and he said, we really need to distinguish, especially in the insurance business, between experience and expertise. And experience, it means, what have we done before? Pardon me, Buffett talked about exposure and risk. But this experience expertise idea experience expertise is also really important because there are often industries where people have lots of experience, but they don't really have expertise, right? So that's the basic idea, is that I think the experts are much less prevalent than people tend to think. And the expertise really tends to work in fairly narrow domains, and we can sort of sketch out what those domains look like.
Does it make sense to think about expertise also in terms of what a machine could emulate versus what human experts are uniquely capable of doing?
Yeah, and that's related to that, right? So in other words, if you are doing something that can be written down in a formula that's applied consistently, then a machine's likely to be able to do your job. And by the way, even things like you think about chess now and Go, these are computationally very difficult things, which lends themselves to machine power. But the rules are unchanging, right? And so that's really important. So for example, in chess, instead of us having an 8x8 board, we change it to 12x12 and actually change the way the pieces moved. There would be no machine that could beat it. There'd be no humans that'd be good at it either, but it would take a long time for the machines to be able to beat humans in that. So it goes back to this idea that these machines, especially specific domains, again, if you can write down the rules and everything is bounded fairly well, machines are going to do really well. Now that's not general intelligence, to state the obvious. That's a set of, those are machines that are developed to do specific tasks. And by the way, these are really, I don't know if this is really interesting to the degree to which, and how do we use machines or technology, computers to help us in the world of investing? And that's obviously a very hot and fascinating area. But a lot of the applications are not that easy because markets themselves tend to be, unstable and non-stationary. And so it's very difficult to extrapolate the recent past or the past into the future.
Let's shift gears a little bit to the psychology of investing. Why did you give it such prominence in the book? And what do you think is the crux of that topic?
Well, I'll mention a couple things. One is, I think I opened the introduction to that section with a quote from Puggy Pearson, who himself was a very colorful gambler. And he had this line, which was awesome. He said, ain't only three things to gambling: knowing the 60-40 end of a proposition, money management, and knowing yourself. And I thought pretty much that encapsulates almost everything we need to know about investing. And the knowing yourself part's really important. I think that the point of emphasis really in that section is a lot of how do we think about collective behavior. And collective behavior is all around us, but certainly in the context of markets. So I want to come back to that in just a second, but I will say that there's a chapter in there that is a little bit controversial, which was I wrote, it's called something like Beware of Behavioral Finance. And I think this is actually a really important lesson for people to take into consideration. And the argument is something that if you read a lot of the literature on behavioral finance, you often read about individual mistakes that you and I make. So we tend to be overconfident, we tend to fall for anchoring, we frame. These are all, loss aversion. These are all things that we can demonstrate in the laboratory and or in the classroom, and those are very real things. But it's important to distinguish between those behaviors and what we actually see in markets, because markets are actually collectives. They're people interacting with one another. And so the nature of collective behavior is actually very different than individual behavior. So my argument was that there are some people who sort of simply argue humans are not, rational, or whatever you want to say. Markets are made up of humans, and hence markets are not rational. And actually, the last thing doesn't follow from the first two, which is to say the aggregation of even suboptimal individuals can lead to very optimal results. So part of the point is that we're not really talking about psychology when we think about markets. We're really talking about sociology, which is how do groups behave in a group setting. And so that was one of the really big things I wanted to emphasize in that whole section, which was almost like a psychological or sociological approach. How do you think about markets? And I think it's often left out in a lot of our discussions. Look, if you've studied finance formally in the classroom, and I do this myself, we typically start with very simple models of sort of rational agents and optimal behaviors and so forth, and you depart from that in terms of the real world. So my point of emphasis is that this idea of psychology of investing and understanding how collectives operate is incredibly important to understanding how markets work and ultimately to the ability to generate excess returns, if that's your objective.
How do you look at that in terms of the market at different points, meaning the aggregation of individual humans in normal times, let's say, versus at points of extreme market stress?
So the basic idea would be that markets tend to be efficient, and we'll call it the wisdom of crowds. The wisdom of crowds is operative when three conditions are in place. One is the underlying agents, in this case investors, come to the market with diverse points of view. So, people are optimistic, people are pessimistic, there's technical traders, fundamental traders, short-term, long-term, so on and so forth. The second condition is that there's a properly functioning aggregation mechanism. So the information that is out in the world is reflected in this case, particular prices. Exchanges do that very well. But I would note that sometimes aggregation falls down because people simply do not participate. And the third are incentives, which are basically rewards for being right and penalties for being wrong. And the argument, I think there's a lot of evidence to support this, that when those three conditions are operative, you get essentially efficient markets, even when the underlying agents have limitations themselves. And that's, you can see very trivial examples of things like the jelly bean jar example. So you've probably seen this, where if you have a jar of jelly beans and you pass it around to a group of people and ask them how many beans are in the jar, the average guess is usually not that good, but if you aggregate people, you get extremely accurate answers. Again, no individual particularly good at it, but collectively extremely good at it. So the flip side of that is when do markets become very interesting, and that is when essentially one or more of those conditions are violated, and by far the most likely to be violated is diversity. So rather than each of us operating independently or with our own views, we correlate our behaviors. Now, investing and humans are very social, but investing is inherently a social exercise. And so from time to time, it comes to pass that people's views collapse upon one another, and people all start to believe the same thing. By the way, even if you take an extreme example of, for example, the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s through 2000, not only were there a lot of enthusiasts buying these particular types of companies, but also there were actually a lot of naysayers who did not believe the values were appropriate. But it's important to note that they simply sat on their hands. They sat out. So they didn't really do anything to change that narrative. They didn't inject some diversity in the markets. So that's tantamount to essentially allowing that particular diversity breakdown to continue. So to me, that's really it. And so what I would all put together is to say, I guess the line that I love so much is from Seth Klarman at Baupost. And Seth has got this great line where he says, value investing is at its core the marriage of a contrarian streak and a calculator. So the contrarian streak says, when others are bullish or bearish, examine the other side of the case. That needn't be a simple way to make money, of course, because sometimes the consensus is correct. And by the way, positive feedback is actually something we see a lot in nature in order to survive. So it's not just being a contrarian. The second component is really essential, and that's the calculator, which is to say, because everyone's uniformly bullish or uniformly bearish, that's led us to a set of expectations that are unduly high or unduly low. And that company or that industry simply cannot satisfy that set of expectations that's priced into the particular stock. And as a consequence, there's going to be a reversal. So to me, that's sort of the package, which is let's think about market efficiency. Let's use this wisdom of crowds framework and the conditions, and then introduce the Klarman thing, which is this contrarian streak plus a calculator to say, it seems like everybody's has a uniform point of view. That seems to be what's expressed in the security price. And through an expectations approach, I'm going to now reverse engineer and say, this is a good bet to be on the other side of the argument.
Shifting to part 3 of the book, Innovation and Competitive Strategy, what do you mean when you say that creative destruction is here to stay?
Very recently, Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize in economics, and this was work on exogenous growth theory. But what I really learned from Romer's work is that innovation essentially is the recombination of building blocks. You could think about certain chunks of ideas or technologies as building blocks, and by recombining them, solve problems in the future. So the degree to which we have more building blocks available at our disposal, and we have tools to manipulate that, and the computing power, that means that we should be able to not only have steady rates of innovation, but even potentially accelerating rates of innovation. So that to me is this argument on creative destruction or innovation, that because the building block there, we are going to continue to see innovation. Obviously, now none of this is in the book. There may be complicating features, for example, like policy or regulation or things like that that may accelerate or stall that rate of innovation. But the basic core idea that Romer laid out in terms of exogenous growth, I think, is a very, very powerful construct. And that was sort of the argument I was trying to make there.
Perhaps more generally, how do you think about the impact of innovation, in particular what we're seeing today in terms of disruption across industries from technology-driven innovation? How do you think about the impact on the sustainability of competitive advantage?
This is a very tricky one. I think that we have now a bit of an arm wrestle going on, so sort of two sides of this argument. So the first side, which I think has been the argument of impeding innovation, has, and I speak mostly from the point of view of the United States, although to a degree it's relevant in other markets as well. But in the United States, what we've seen really certainly the last 20 or 25 years is substantial consolidation of industries. So the number of participants, formal way of measuring this, for example, something called a Herfindahl index, which is a measure of industry concentration. And Herfindahl indexes have been going up, which means industries are becoming more concentrated. Most of that is a consequence of mergers and acquisitions. So the states, for example, the Justice Department and FTC will allow companies essentially to merge. And with fewer participants, that is likely to lead to easier coordination, it could be pricing, and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, you might argue that that is probably, to some degree, or so many have argued, that that has blunted innovation. I alluded to this a moment ago, but maybe reiterating that things like regulation, which again are meant to improve behaviors of incumbents, often can become a barrier to competitors as well. So sometimes, just regulatory adherence can be a cost that's too onerous for an upstart to deal with. And that's probably, financial services, probably an area where that's a really interesting consideration. Banks, for instance, you think about the amount of dollars that the very large banks, certainly in the States, but really around the world, spend on compliance and so forth. It's a very difficult thing to tackle. So that's the one hand, and that's an important consideration. On the other hand, it's just exactly this, what I just mentioned a moment ago, which is it's the recombination or putting together technologies in a way that are fairly novel, and that should lead to new solution problems. And if you even go back, I mean, you think about businesses like, young businesses. Amazon.com is a good example where, at the time it came along, was able to tap, obviously, things like the internet, so the cables and wires that have been laid to allow people to have access to the internet, a distribution system in the form of the Postal Service or UPS or what have you. So there are, different types of software, technology for warehouses and so forth. So these things all came together in a way that would clearly have not been possible 10, 15, or 20 years before. And I think that kind of theme is going to continue as well. So like, what are the resources we have at our exposure? So to answer your question more specifically, and this is an ongoing thread of research, as you probably know, in terms of thinking about competitive advantage, there are some very, I thought thoughtful papers. The main ones are by Wiggins and Roofley on this, that the argument that competitive advantage has been shrinking. And you measure that, by the way, specifically by measures of excess returns, so excess rents that are being earned. But this is always a difficult one to measure, right? Because we can look at certainly the past, but it's very difficult to look at things today. So, my own sense is it's very difficult for certain companies to stay on top. The flip side is we are seeing, if you look at, for example, margins of businesses, what we're seeing is that the top 20%, top quintile, and really the top decile of certain types of businesses are very, very strong. And you think about certain businesses that have strong in place network effects. It's not super clear about how those network effects will be eroded by competition. So the long and short of it is I don't really know. I do think as an investor, when you're buying any particular stock, what you want to think about is what kind of competitive advantage am I paying for? And do I think that that's certainly plausible given a thoughtful and thorough competitive strategy analysis? But to come up with any sort of concrete judgment for any particular company or industry or sector, I think is really a tricky task.
You ask the question, is there a fly in your portfolio? In the book, tell us about the metaphor of fruit flies.
Yeah, and that's related, John, to the question you just posed. So the metaphor there was about this Drosophila, which is a particular type of fly that geneticists have studied because these flies reproduce very quickly. So you get lots of generations that happen, and so you can sort of analyze how various things happen. It's almost like speeds up the world. And the question I sort of posed out loud or thought about or mused about out loud, and there are certain academics who certainly believe this view, is whether we're simply speeding up, the world is just speeding up, and that we're becoming more a world of Drosophila, things are happening faster and faster. And there's a particular professor, Charles Fine, who actually has done work on certain cycles of speed for various industries, and making the claim essentially that the clock speed has been accelerating. So, that is the basic argument. And by the way, these are all things that investors should really take into consideration very deeply when they're looking at a particular company or a product, is to say, what is the likely life of this product? How do I think about that? What could unseat it? And certain companies, for example, have to create new products very rapidly, even if it's in the same business. And you think about the evolution, for example, of disk drives or something like that, where there were very short product lives and you had to have a new product behind the old one in order to continue your competitive positioning. So yeah, that's the idea behind the idea of Drosophila.
Is there a link there at all to profit margins, which have been, I guess, near historical highs. How do you think about reversion to mean there in light of innovation?
So we published a piece a few years ago called the Base Rate Book, and if you search for Base Rate Book and Michael Mauboussin, you'll probably find it. And there we actually looked at a fairly large sweep of corporate performance, the history of corporate performance back to, in many cases, 1950s, in most cases certainly 1980s. And in that, we actually analyzed the base rate of corporate performance, and one of the chapters is on specifically operating margins. In that piece, by the way, the opening is about, I don't know, there's 15 or 20 pages, including a lot of pictures, but 15 or 20 pages, it actually talks a lot about almost precisely the question you're posing about how do we think about regression toward the mean and the rapidity with which that happens. And I'll state something I think on reflection is a fairly obvious comment, which is if you go through the P&L, for example, to start, so you go through sales and gross profits and operating income or operating margins down to net income, there are varying degrees of persistence, or saying the opposite, the regression toward the mean happens at different rates for each of those different things. So in particular, to shine a spotlight on the question you posed about operating margins, we analyzed operating margins back to 1950. Again, it's a large sample. It's north of it's 1,000 companies, or even a little bit more than that. And what we found was something quite interesting. First of all, that operating margins are actually not a rapidly mean reverting series. So some people say that margins are inevitably going to revert to the mean. That's just empirically not correct. That is not a rapidly mean reverting series. But perhaps the more consequential observation is if you look at margins over time and break it into quintiles, so 5 different bins, what you'll find is that the bottom 3 bins, they obviously move up and down. The margins move up and down with sort of the economic cycle. But I'm going to call those roughly, dissimilar to the past. And what you see is the top 2 quintiles, and in particular, the top quintile has the one that's really run away from the pack. It's gotten much, much higher. And so that becomes an interesting question as to why those margins have gone up so much. I think a lot of people, and I'm sympathetic to this argument, a lot of people have argued that's a consequence of many of these sort of winner-take-all, network effect type of businesses, and also capital light businesses, right? So businesses where intellectual property tends to be at the core versus physical assets that allows for a lot of scalability and hence a lot of very high incremental profit margins. So I think that when we talk about margins and regression toward the mean, I think it's a much more nuanced argument, and you really do need to unpack it a little bit and say, what are we talking about in terms of where you are in terms of the ranking, in terms of the operating margins, and ask the question as to whether those high return on high margin businesses, what is underpinning those high margins, and is that likely to be something that changes in the next few years? So I'm a little bit, I hear the mumblings about margins being as high as they are. I don't have a strong view on this, but I'm a little bit more certain it's just not a clean story that you can say they're too high and they have to go lower. You need to parse that, and I think in some detail, and really think about the different components to come up with a thoughtful point of view.
Michael, before we wrap up, perhaps we can touch briefly on part 4 as well. How do you think about complexity theory in terms of its use in investing, and what do you think are the biggest hurdles that remain in that theory to actually applying it day to day?
Yeah. Well, I will just say in terms of my own education or evolutionary process and understanding how markets work, I probably started, as many people did, with almost like a University of Chicago markets are efficient camp. And I would just say for many people, the default of market efficiency is probably not a bad place to default. So in other words, if you have no view, assuming the market's smarter than you and their prices are pretty good reflections of value, is probably not a crazy place to start. But what the Santa Fe Institute and this notion of complex adaptive systems introduced into my thinking and really into my language is something I alluded to before, which is this markets as complex adaptive system. So I think I used the phrase a few moments ago, the wisdom of crowds. I'm gonna say that these are somewhat interchangeable, but recognizing markets as complex adaptive systems opens up a whole new way of thinking, I think a whole new set of tools. and I think are a way to reconcile the reality that markets are hard to beat, which if you're in the markets, you know that to be true, and markets periodically go haywire. And, we know that to be true as well. So how do you bring those two, how do you put those things in under the same tent? And I think the complex adaptive systems approach does that. Again, specifically, just to reiterate, the conditions for efficiency on diversity and aggregation and incentives, I think are a really good way to think about that. The other thing that helped me a great deal was this was an automatic entree into discussions about things like fat tails. Obviously, Nassim Taleb wrote a book in 2001 called Fooled by Randomness, which introduced the world to understanding the role of luck in things. That was great, but I think he probably made a bigger splash with the Black Swan, which talked about this notion of these sort of fat tail or unusual events. And so related to that is also this notion of nonlinearity. So a lot of functions in the world are not linear, they're nonlinear, which almost always creates surprise for individuals. So to me, that's another part of I would put under this science and complexity thing, which is really interesting. Where do we have to go on this? I mean, to me, one of the big holy grails is understanding specifically how can we link, I mentioned a moment ago the diversity breakdowns. How do we actually measure those things? Is there a way for us to do this in an effective fashion? And so to me, that's a very exciting area. Now, there's obviously work on things like crowdedness, which I think is a first order way of thinking about that. But can we develop a richer theory for that? We have some insights about that from things like agent-based models, where we create a market ecosystem in a computer, and we let agents trade with one another. But again, that's just the first step. So I think to me, that's the area that we could really develop further is understanding that. The other thing I'll mention quickly, I don't think it's mentioned in the book because this book came out after my book, but Didier Sornet wrote a very fascinating book called Why Stock Markets Crash. And so the other interesting questions related, but the other interesting question is, are there signatures, statistical signatures or precursors in markets as they may be in other systems that would allow us to at least increase the probability, if not anticipate some sort of market break. So those are, I think, super exciting areas of potential research in this area.
And Michael, perhaps for the last question, if you'll allow me to move beyond the book a little bit, I'd love to hear about your writing process. You've been so prolific and have delivered so much wisdom for all of us to consume. How does your process actually look like?
I wish I had a good answer for this question. I'll just mention a couple of things. First, and I'm probably not on, I mentioned at the outset of our conversation that, I'm someone who's reading and thinking and watching and basically like almost having a dialogue with his content. And so part of this is figuring out what are interesting topics to talk about. And, I'll give you a couple examples. One is, measuring the moat. So we did a lot of work on trying to create a framework for understanding sustainable competitive advantage. And I, like many other people, I suspect, had read widely on this, from Michael Porter to Clay Christensen and others, but I really hadn't seen it or myself organize it in a cohesive fashion. So almost for myself, I put together Measuring the Moat, which, by the way, was a very difficult process for me. But in a sense, it was an attempt to synthesize a lot of different things. Another example is, I read Will Thorndike's book, The Outsiders, about capital allocation. Came out in 2012, I believe. Just a wonderful book. Will's a great guy. And what he did to illustrate his point is he selected, I think, 8 CEOs and showed how those CEOs were really super efficient capital allocators, many of whom came from backgrounds that were sort of atypical for executives. And that was also really cool and inspiring. But I thought to myself, I don't really know how thousands of companies have spent their money. So we spent a lot of time on capital allocation, again, looking at the top 1,000 companies in the United States. We looked at how they spend every dollar back to 1980. That's a very big project. So that's the first thing, is just finding interesting topics to write about. And there's no dearth of things to do today, by the way. There are a lot of really interesting themes that people talk about bits and pieces, but really haven't put it together in cohesive fashion. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'll mention is, it came out a lot after this book, but in terms of my workflow, I learned a lot. The last two books, Think Twice and The Success Equation, I worked with an editor named Lawrence Gonzalez. Lawrence is a dear friend. He actually has an affiliation as a Miller Scholar at the Santa Fe Institute, but basically a writer and a journalist, but a guy with a fascinating personal background, lots of varied experiences. And when I gave Lawrence some of my books to edit, he not only edited them, he actually taught me a lot about writing. And so I think really in the last 10 or 12 years, I've learned probably more about writing than I've learned, my whole life. And a lot of it was through the instruction of a very talented guy like Lawrence. And I'll also mention in that case that Steven Pinker, who's known as a psychologist primarily, wrote a book about basically it's about style, how to write. And I'll just say that the first 3 or 4 chapters, I think the first 3 chapters, in particular chapter 3 of that book, incredibly powerful for helping, I think, helping people understand how to write effectively and how to be concrete and how to make visions very solid for the reader. So I try to think it's just really what are the interesting topics. As someone who's trying to communicate effectively, what have I learned to do, and who have I turned to help me become more effective at that. Last thing I'll mention, we spend a lot of time, probably too much time, on visualization. So we spend a lot, I spend a lot of time thinking about and studying data visualization to try to make sure that whatever exhibits we also share in our work are things that are they can stand on their own, they're clear, and in some way they contribute to the overall discussion. So I wish I had a better answer. It's funny you say that I'm productive. I actually often feel like I feel like I'm not productive because my idea generation is faster than my output, but it's great. And as I said, I always think that even when I was writing the Concilian Observer, the backbone for More Than You Know, I had a running list of things I wanted to write about. And I'm like, I'm going to run out of stuff to talk about. And sure enough, it was a never-ending list of things to work on. So I think we're blessed to be in an industry that's absolutely fascinating, that has nonstop learning. The world is constantly changing. There are lots of puzzles for us to solve. And I think I mentioned at the conclusion of More Than You Know, I tell my students the very first day of class, I'm going to guide a course, but at the end of the day, there are a lot more questions and answers, and so. Part of the jewel, part of the fun, part of the goal is for us to explore those questions and try to get a little bit closer to the truth and to understanding.
Well, Michael, this has been terrific. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here, talk to us about More Than You Know, and to share your wisdom. It's always such a privilege and a pleasure. Goodbye for now.